You're getting fined again. Maybe if you can't afford to follow the rules, you should sell this house and leave.
The black homeowner looked at the violation notice, then calmly folded it and slipped it into his pocket. What she didn't realize was that the man she had spent weeks targeting wasn't intimidated. He was investigating. Harry Johnson was quietly uncovering something far more dangerous than discrimination. A secret that could destroy the most powerful woman in the neighborhood. The HOA president thought she was hunting her next victim. She never imagined she was becoming someone's biggest case. And when the truth finally came out, an entire community would learn who the real criminal was. The late summer heat settled heavily over the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. Even before noon, waves of warmth shimmered above the manicured streets of Silver Oak Estates, a gated luxury community where every lawn looked perfect and every home seemed designed to impress. Silver Oak Estates was the kind of neighborhood that appeared in real estate magazines. Massive stone mansions lined the streets, fountains sparkled beneath the Texas sun, and carefully maintained gardens surrounded properties worth millions of dollars. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. To those who lived there, however, power often mattered more than appearances. Andrea Langford made sure everyone remembered that. At 62 years old, Andrea was the longtime president of the Silver Oak Estates Homeowners Association. She was a tall woman with carefully styled blonde hair swept into an elegant updo, sharp blue eyes, and the kind of expensive wardrobe that announced wealth before she spoke a single word. Her favorite color seemed to be red. Whether attending HOA meetings or touring the neighborhood, she often wore tailored red suits that made her impossible to miss. Most residents described Andrea the same way: efficient, demanding, unforgiving. Years earlier, after a bitter divorce that had left her fighting for financial security, Andrea had built her reputation through sheer determination. Unfortunately, that determination had slowly evolved into something else. She no longer viewed herself as a community volunteer. She viewed herself as the ruler of Silver Oak Estates. Every rule, every landscaping requirement, every neighborhood dispute eventually flowed through her office, and Andrea enjoyed that power. On that particular morning, she was driving her cream-colored golf cart through the neighborhood conducting one of her regular inspections. She carried a clipboard on her lap, and sunglasses covered her eyes despite the shade from the cart's roof. As she turned onto Magnolia Court, something immediately caught her attention. A man was working in one of the gardens. Andrea slowed the cart. The property belonged to Lot 47, one of the largest estates in the entire community. The mansion sat behind wrought iron gates, surrounded by flowering shrubs, marble walkways, and dozens of carefully cultivated flower beds. The man knelt beside one of those beds, his hands covered in gardening gloves as he carefully replanted several flowering bushes. Andrea frowned. She had never seen him before. From a distance, she assumed he was part of a landscaping crew. The man stood as she approached. His name was Harry Johnson. At 48 years old, Harry was a physically imposing man. He stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, dark brown skin, and a strong jawline partially framed by a neatly trimmed beard. Short black hair touched with faint streaks of gray gave him a distinguished appearance. Despite his size, his expression was calm and thoughtful rather than intimidating. People who knew Harry often described him as unusually patient. Years spent navigating difficult professional environments had taught him the value of self-control. He rarely raised his voice and almost never reacted emotionally, even when others expected him to. That patience would soon be tested. Andrea stopped her cart directly beside the flower bed. Without greeting him, she pointed toward the bushes. "Who authorized these changes?" Harry looked at her calmly. "Good morning." Andrea's face tightened. "I asked who authorized these landscaping changes." Harry removed one glove and extended his hand politely. "My name is Harry Johnson." Andrea ignored the gesture. "Are you the contractor?" Harry lowered his hand. "No." "Then who hired you?" A faint smile appeared on Harry's face. "I hired myself." Andrea stared at him. The answer irritated her immediately. She glanced at her clipboard. "I don't see any landscaping approval request for this property." Harry looked around his own yard. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to plant flowers." Andrea removed her sunglasses. "You absolutely do." Several nearby residents had begun noticing the conversation. One of them was Sarah Mitchell, a retired elementary school teacher who lived across the street. Sarah was a friendly woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut into a short bob and a reputation for knowing everything that happened in the neighborhood. She paused while watering her roses, sensing trouble. Andrea stepped out of the cart. "The HOA requires approval before any modifications are made to visible landscaping." Harry nodded. "I'll review the guidelines." The calm response only seemed to frustrate Andrea further. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Which landscaping company do you work for?" For the first time, Harry's expression hardened slightly. "I don't." Andrea crossed her arms. "So you're saying you're the homeowner?" "Yes." Several seconds passed. Sarah nearly dropped her watering can. Andrea's face revealed clear disbelief. She slowly looked from Harry to the mansion behind him and back again. Something about the way she examined him made her assumption obvious. Harry noticed it. So did everyone else. Andrea recovered quickly. Well, homeowner or not, you're already in violation. Harry glanced at the flowers. Because I planted hydrangeas? Because you ignored HOA procedures? She pointed toward the flower bed. Then, in a move that stunned everyone watching, Andrea accelerated the golf cart forward. The front wheels rolled partially into the edge of the freshly prepared garden bed, crushing several plants and sending dark soil spraying across the flowers. Gasps echoed from nearby yards. Sarah stood frozen. Harry stepped backward, staring at the damage. For a moment, silence filled the air. Andrea pointed directly at him. You will restore this property to HOA standards immediately. Harry slowly removed both gloves. This is my property. You live in this community, Andrea replied sharply. That means you follow my rules. The words hung heavily in the air. Around them, neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. But while Andrea appeared triumphant, Harry simply looked at the damaged flowers. Then he raised his eyes and met hers. There was no anger in his expression, no fear, only a quiet certainty that seemed to unsettle her. Andrea mistook his silence for surrender. She climbed back into her golf cart and drove away without another word. The moment she disappeared around the corner, Sarah cautiously approached. Are you all right? Harry continued staring at the crushed flower bed. Then he gave a small nod. Yes, but his eyes had changed. For the first time that morning, something deeper appeared behind his calm demeanor. Because Harry Johnson had just realized this was never about landscaping, and before long he intended to find out exactly what it was about. Dark clouds drifted across the Dallas skyline as another hot Texas afternoon settled over Silver Oak Estates. The air felt heavy and oppressive, as if a storm was building somewhere beyond the horizon. 3 days had passed since Andrea Langford drove her golf cart through Harry Johnson's flower bed. The damage to the flowers had been repaired. The damage to the relationship between the two neighbors had not. Andrea sat behind the polished mahogany desk inside the HOA office, reviewing paperwork with growing irritation. At 62 years old, she had spent nearly a decade of life inside Silver Oak Estates. Residents obeyed HOA regulations. Contractors followed HOA procedures. Homeowners who challenged her authority usually learned very quickly that doing so came with consequences. Harry Johnson had not learned that lesson. At least not yet. Andrea adjusted her glasses and opened a file bearing Harry's address. A small smile appeared on her face. She had a plan. The following morning, Harry discovered the first notice attached to his front door. HOA violation. The letter claimed that his mailbox color did not comply with community guidelines. Harry read it twice. Then he laughed. His mailbox had been the same color for nearly 4 years. 2 days later, another violation arrived. The notice claimed that a section of his driveway contained minor discoloration and required immediate correction. 3 days after that, another letter appeared. This one cited improper hedge maintenance. By the end of the second week, Harry had accumulated 7 separate violation notices. Every one of them was questionable. Everyone carried financial penalties. Most homeowners would have become angry. Harry became curious. That reaction came naturally to him. At 48 years old, Harry had spent much of his life studying patterns, motivations, and hidden connections. His calm personality often caused people to underestimate him. They saw a polite man who enjoyed gardening and quiet evenings on his patio. They rarely saw the investigator beneath the surface. One afternoon, Harry sat inside his home office reviewing the growing stack of HOA notices. The office was lined with bookshelves filled with legal references, financial publications, and investigative reports. Framed awards decorated one wall, though visitors rarely noticed them because Harry never mentioned them. A photograph near his desk showed a younger version of himself standing beside several federal investigators. Harry glanced at the image briefly. It reminded him of another life. For more than 15 years, he had worked as a senior financial investigator. His career had taken him across the country uncovering fraud schemes, corporate corruption, embezzlement networks, and financial crimes worth millions of dollars. His reputation for patience and attention to detail eventually led major corporations and anti-corruption agencies to seek his expertise as a consultant. Very few people in Silver Oak Estates knew any of that. Andrea certainly didn't. To her, Harry was simply a homeowner who refused to obey. Outside, a white SUV slowly rolled past Harry's property. The vehicle stopped briefly before continuing down the street. Harry noticed. The same SUV appeared again the following day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, he finally learned why. Sarah Mitchell knocked on his door. The retired schoolteacher looked concerned. Sarah was a woman in her late 60s with kind gray eyes and silver hair cut neatly around her face. Years spent teaching elementary school had made her observant and compassionate. She often noticed things other residents overlooked. "I thought you should know something," she said. Harry invited her inside. Sarah lowered her voice. "That SUV belongs to a private inspection company." Harry raised an eyebrow. "A private inspection company?" Sarah nodded. I heard Andrea hired them. For what? To monitor your property. For several seconds, Harry said nothing. Then he smiled. Not because the news surprised him, because it confirmed his suspicions. Andrea wasn't enforcing rules. She was targeting him. Over the next several days, additional reports reached Harry through other residents. Some were reluctant to speak openly. Others insisted their names remain confidential. But a pattern quickly emerged. Several homeowners described similar experiences. Years earlier, they had questioned HOA fees. Shortly afterward, they received unusual violation notices. Others had challenged spending decisions. They suddenly found themselves buried under inspections and fines. One family had eventually sold their home and moved away. Another had quietly settled a dispute simply to avoid legal expenses. Fear had become part of the community, and fear was exactly what Andrea relied on. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows of his study, Harry began reviewing publicly available HOA financial documents. What he found immediately caught his attention. Several landscaping contracts appeared unusually expensive. Maintenance costs seemed significantly higher than comparable communities. Some payments lacked detailed explanations. Others contained vague descriptions that would have raised questions in any professional audit. Harry leaned back in his chair. His expression remained calm, but his mind was moving quickly. Years of investigative work had taught him to recognize warning signs, and he was seeing several. Not evidence, not yet, but warning signs, the kind that deserved a closer look. Across the neighborhood, Andrea sat inside her own home feeling satisfied. She believed her strategy was working. Sooner or later, Harry would grow frustrated. Sooner or later, he would decide life elsewhere was easier. Sooner or later, he would leave. What Andrea didn't realize was that every violation notice she sent only increased Harry's interest. Every act of intimidation pushed him deeper into the HOA's records. Every attempt to pressure him created another reason to keep digging. As thunder echoed across the Texas night, Harry closed one financial report and opened another. The stack of documents beside him continued growing. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, something far more dangerous was beginning. Because Andrea Langford still believed she was dealing with an ordinary homeowner. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who had spent most of his career exposing people who thought they were untouchable. A cold rain swept across Dallas throughout the night, leaving the streets of Silver Oak Estates slick and unusually quiet by morning. Dark clouds still lingered overhead, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and luxury homes. Inside his study, Harry Johnson sat surrounded by stacks of documents. The room looked more like an investigative office than a home workspace. Financial statements covered one side of his desk. HOA meeting minutes occupied another. Several notebooks filled with handwritten observations sat beside his laptop. For nearly 3 weeks, Harry had reviewed records late into the night, while Andrea Langford continued sending violation notices and applying pressure. Most people would have given up. Harry became more determined. Years of investigative work had taught him that corruption rarely revealed itself through a single mistake. Instead, it left behind hundreds of small clues that only became visible when someone took the time to connect them. That morning, Harry finally began seeing the full picture. Several landscaping contracts approved by the HOA over the previous 7 years repeatedly led back to the same small group of companies. At first glance, the businesses appeared unrelated. Different names, different addresses, different owners. But the deeper Harry dug, the stranger things became. One company shared a mailing address with another contractor. A second company listed a phone number that matched a third vendor. Several business registrations contained signatures from individuals connected to Andrea's inner circle. Harry leaned back in his chair. He had seen similar structures before. Shell companies. Companies created to move money without attracting attention, and suddenly millions of dollars in HOA spending began making much more sense. Later that afternoon, Harry drove across Dallas to meet someone who had once lived in Silver Oak Estates. His name was Robert Martin. Robert was 72 years old, a retired Air Force veteran with broad shoulders, neatly trimmed white hair, and deep lines etched across his weathered face. Years of military service had given him a disciplined personality, but a prolonged battle with cancer several years earlier had left him physically weaker than he once was. Despite that, his eyes remained sharp and observant. They met inside a quiet coffee shop. Robert listened carefully as Harry explained his investigation. Then he sighed. I always wondered if someone would eventually look into this. Harry remained silent. Robert continued. My wife and I challenged an HOA renovation project 6 years ago. What happened? Robert laughed bitterly. Everything. Within weeks of questioning the project, violation notices began arriving. Inspectors appeared repeatedly. Legal threats followed. The pressure became relentless. Eventually, Robert and his wife sold their home and moved away. At the time, he believed Andrea simply wanted revenge. Now he wasn't so sure. Before leaving, Robert handed Harry a thick folder. I kept everything. Harry opened it. Inside were letters, violation notices, contractor estimates, HOA correspondence, and meeting records. more pieces of the puzzle, and more evidence that Robert had not been the only target. Over the following days, Harry spoke with several former residents. The stories were disturbingly similar. Older homeowners, widows living alone, minority families, residents who asked too many questions. Many eventually faced escalating fines and legal pressure until selling their properties. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The targets were not random. They were vulnerable, and after their homes entered the market, properties were often purchased at unusually favorable prices by buyers connected to individuals within Andrea's circle. The deeper Harry investigated, the darker the story became. One evening, Sarah Mitchell sat across from Harry's dining room table reviewing documents. The retired teacher adjusted her reading glasses and shook her head. "This can't be a coincidence." "No," Harry agreed. "It isn't." Sarah looked exhausted. For years, she had suspected Andrea abused her authority. Now she was beginning to understand how extensive the scheme truly was. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Harry glanced toward the growing stacks of evidence. "Keep digging." Unfortunately, he was not the only person paying attention. Inside the HOA office, Andrea Langford was becoming increasingly nervous. The confident woman who once viewed Harry as a nuisance now saw something far more dangerous, a threat. At 62, Andrea remained outwardly composed, but pressure was beginning to show. Small lines appeared around her eyes. Her patience grew shorter during meetings. Employees noticed her temper becoming unpredictable. She had started asking questions, too many questions. One afternoon, Andrea summoned a board member named Michael Reeves. Michael was a 54-year-old accountant with thinning brown hair, narrow features, and a habit of avoiding direct confrontation. Unlike Andrea, he lacked confidence and often followed stronger personalities. Years earlier, financial setbacks had left him vulnerable to influence, making him one of Andrea's most loyal supporters. Andrea closed her office door. "Has Harry requested additional records?" Michael nodded nervously. "A few." Andrea's expression darkened. "What did you give him?" "Only public documents." Andrea stared at him. Then she stood. "We need to clean up some files." Michael's stomach tightened. Neither of them said the words out loud. They didn't have to. Later that week, several digital records unexpectedly disappeared from HOA databases. Archived documents were suddenly unavailable. Storage boxes were removed from a records room. Meeting notes that should have existed could no longer be located. But in their panic, Andrea and her associates made a mistake. Actually, several mistakes. Harry had already downloaded copies of many files. More importantly, every deleted document created a new trail. Missing records attracted attention. Deleted records raised questions. Destroyed evidence often became evidence itself. By attempting to hide information, Andrea was exposing something far more damaging. One night, shortly after midnight, Harry sat alone in his study reviewing another collection of files. The rain tapped softly against the windows. His eyes moved across a series of payment transfers. Then he froze. A name appeared repeatedly across multiple companies. Not Andrea. Someone else. Someone connected to nearly every suspicious contract. Harry stared at the screen. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he felt certain. This was no longer a collection of irregularities. This was a network. A carefully constructed system that had operated for years, and somewhere at the center of it stood Andrea Langford. Across town, Andrea sat awake in her luxury home, unable to sleep. She told herself everything was under control. She told herself Harry had nothing. She told herself the records were gone. But deep down, for the first time since becoming HOA president, Andrea felt something unfamiliar, fear, because every step she took to protect herself seemed to leave another footprint behind, and Harry Johnson was following every one of them. Heavy gray clouds blanketed Dallas from dawn, and a cold wind swept through Silver Oak Estates. By early afternoon, hundreds of residents were making their way toward the community conference hall for the annual HOA meeting, unaware they were about to witness the most shocking event in the neighborhood's history. The Silver Oak Estates Community Center had never been so crowded. Rows of chairs filled the massive hall. Homeowners stood along the walls when seats ran out. Conversations echoed throughout the room as residents discussed recent controversies involving the HOA and the increasingly public dispute between Andrea Langford and Harry Johnson. At the front of the room stood Andrea. She looked confident, as always. The 62-year-old HOA president wore another of her signature tailored red suits. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her posture projected complete authority. To anyone who didn't know the situation, she appeared to be a woman fully in control. But beneath the polished exterior, anxiety was growing. Andrea had barely slept in days. Still, she believed she could regain control. All she needed to do was convince the community that Harry Johnson was the problem. She stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The room gradually became silent. "Thank you all for attending," Andrea began. Several residents nodded politely. For months now, Silver Oak Estates has been subjected to unnecessary conflict. Her eyes moved directly toward Harry. He sat quietly several rows from the front beside Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, the retired teacher with silver hair and kind gray eyes, immediately recognized where the speech was heading. Andrea continued. Unfortunately, certain individuals have chosen to disrupt our community, challenge established procedures, and spread harmful accusations. Murmurs spread through the audience. Harry remained calm. Andrea pointed toward him. Mr. Harry Johnson has repeatedly attempted to undermine this association and create division among residents. A few people exchanged uncertain glances. Others appeared uncomfortable. Andrea sensed hesitation and pressed forward. Our neighborhood has thrived for years under responsible leadership. Yet one individual has chosen to attack that success. For a brief moment, she believed she had regained the room. Then a voice came from the audience. May I respond? Every head turned. Harry had stood. The room became completely silent. Andrea's smile disappeared. Harry walked calmly toward the stage. Unlike Andrea, he wore a simple navy blazer over a light blue shirt. There was nothing flashy about him, yet the confidence in his movements immediately drew attention. He stopped beside the podium. Please, Harry said, let everyone hear both sides. Andrea hesitated. Hundreds of residents were watching. Refusing would make her look afraid. Finally, she stepped aside. Harry approached the microphone. Good afternoon. The room remained silent. For weeks, many of you have been told that I'm causing problems. He paused. So today I'd like to present the facts. Several large projection screens hung from the walls behind him. Harry clicked a remote. The first image appeared instantly, a financial spreadsheet. Then another, and another. The room leaned forward. Harry calmly explained how multiple landscaping companies receiving HOA funds shared addresses, phone numbers, and ownership connections. A few residents frowned. Others looked confused. Then Harry displayed a chart linking the companies together. Gasps spread through the hall. For the first time, people could see the pattern. Millions of dollars had flowed through businesses connected to the same small network. Andrea's face lost color. Harry wasn't finished. The next screen displayed internal HOA emails. The room became even quieter. Several messages discussed targeting homeowners who questioned HOA spending. Others referenced increased inspections and aggressive enforcement strategies. One email contained language so blatant that people began reading it aloud to each other. A woman in the audience covered her mouth. A man near the back shook his head in disbelief. Andrea's hands tightened around the edge of her chair. Then came the recordings. Harry played audio captured from archived HOA communications. Andrea's voice filled the hall. Residents listened as she discussed applying pressure to certain homeowners. The recordings weren't dramatic. They were worse. They sounded routine, as if targeting residents had become normal business. Shock spread across the room. Harry advanced to the next slide. Property records appeared. Highlighted transactions connected former HOA targets with below-market home sales. Several purchases led back to individuals linked to Andrea's network. The silence became overwhelming. Then another voice spoke. Robert Martin slowly stood. The 72-year-old Air Force veteran looked around the room. Many residents recognized him immediately. I was one of those homeowners, he said. People listened. Robert described years of pressure, fines, inspections, and legal threats. He explained how his family eventually sold their home simply to escape the harassment. By the time he finished, several audience members looked furious. Then another resident stood, and another, and another. One by one, former homeowners and current residents began sharing similar stories. A retired widow described months of intimidation after questioning HOA fees. A Hispanic family explained how repeated violations appeared after they challenged a neighborhood assessment. An elderly homeowner recalled being pressured to sell after refusing a costly renovation demand. The testimonies continued. Each story strengthened the next. Each witness added another piece of the puzzle. The mood inside the hall shifted dramatically. Andrea could feel it happening. The same residents who once applauded her leadership were now staring at her with suspicion, some with anger, others with betrayal. For years she had controlled every meeting. Now she could barely speak. Finally, Andrea rose to her feet. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Her voice echoed through the hall. These accusations are completely false. But even as she spoke, another image appeared on the screen. A transfer record. Then another. Then another. The financial trail was impossible to ignore. Michael Reeves, the 54-year-old HOA board member who had helped Andrea manage records, sat frozen near the front row. Sweat covered his forehead. Several residents noticed. So did Harry. The room erupted into shouting. Residents demanded explanations. Questions came from every direction. Some demanded audits. Others demanded resignation. For the first time in years, Andrea had no control over the room. Harry stepped away from the podium. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Andrea looked around the hall. The faces she once commanded now reflected disappointment, anger, and outrage. The woman who had spent years ordering everyone else what to do had suddenly become the center of every accusation. And as the meeting descended into chaos, Andrea Langford realized something she had never imagined possible. She was no longer the most powerful person in Silver Oak Estates. She was now its most scrutinized. The storm that had hovered over Dallas for days finally passed. Bright Texas sunlight returned to Silver Oak Estates. illuminating the neighborhood's stone mansions and perfectly trimmed lawns as if the community itself had been given a fresh beginning. But beneath that peaceful morning, the consequences of years of deception were only beginning. The annual HOA meeting had ended in chaos. Within 48 hours, independent auditors arrived at Silver Oak Estates. Attorneys representing dozens of residents began requesting records. State investigators opened formal inquiries into HOA finances. What had started as a dispute over a flower bed had grown into one of the largest scandals in the community's history. For the first time in years, Andrea Langford was no longer in control. The 62-year-old former HOA president sat alone inside her attorney's office, staring at a stack of legal documents. The confident woman who once commanded every meeting looked dramatically different now. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes. Her posture had become tense and defensive. Every day seemed to bring another lawsuit, another subpoena, or another former resident willing to testify. The system she had spent years building was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Meanwhile, investigators continued uncovering new evidence. Several HOA contracts were declared fraudulent. Financial records revealed extensive misuse of community funds. Property transactions linked to Andrea's network received additional scrutiny. As more information emerged, former residents began coming forward in larger numbers. Families who had once been too afraid to speak now shared their stories publicly. Retired couples described years of intimidation. Minority homeowners recounted discriminatory treatment. Widows explained how they had been pressured into accepting unfair settlements simply to avoid endless legal battles. The pattern was undeniable. What residents once suspected had now been proven. Months passed. Then came the decision many people had been waiting for. Andrea Langford was officially removed from all HOA authority. Her resignation was not voluntary. The board voted unanimously after reviewing the findings. Michael Reeves, the 54-year-old board member who had once followed Andrea's lead, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. Facing serious legal exposure himself, he provided documents and communications that further strengthened the case against the former HOA leadership. The old administration was finished. Soon afterward, an independent oversight committee was established to rebuild trust within the community. One of its leaders was Judge Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor was a retired federal judge in her early 70s with short silver hair, sharp green eyes, and a reputation for fairness that stretched across decades of public service. Years spent presiding over difficult cases had taught her to remain calm under pressure, and residents immediately respected her commitment to transparency. Unlike previous HOA leadership, Eleanor insisted every major financial decision be publicly documented. Every contract would be reviewed. Every expenditure would be explained. Every resident would have access to information. For the first time in many years, homeowners felt their voices mattered. The reforms moved quickly. Questionable contracts were terminated. Financial oversight procedures were strengthened. Independent audits became mandatory. Several families who had suffered financial harm received compensation through legal settlements and restitution funds. Others regained property rights that had previously been restricted under questionable HOA actions. One afternoon, Sarah Mitchell stood outside the community center, watching workers install new signage promoting transparency initiatives. The retired schoolteacher smiled. For years, she had watched neighbors grow afraid to speak. Now those same people were openly participating in meetings again. The atmosphere felt entirely different. Hope had returned. And through all of it, Harry Johnson remained largely absent from the spotlight. Residents repeatedly encouraged him to run for HOA leadership. Some suggested he become board president. Others proposed advisory positions. Harry declined every offer. That response surprised many people, but not those who truly knew him. Harry had never pursued recognition. His goal had never been power. It had always been accountability. One warm Saturday morning, several months after the investigation began, Sarah walked past Harry's property and noticed him working in the garden. The same garden where the conflict had started. The hydrangeas were thriving now. Colorful flowers stretched across the landscape. Fresh mulch surrounded the flower beds. Butterflies drifted between blossoms. Harry knelt beside a row of flowers with gardening gloves on his hands. For a moment, it looked exactly like the day Andrea had first confronted him. Except everything had changed. Sarah approached the fence. "You know," she said, smiling, "most people would have written a book by now." Harry laughed. "I don't think anyone would read it." "I would." They both smiled. For several moments, they simply admired the garden. Finally, Sarah looked around the neighborhood. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Neighbors greeted one another. Residents gathered casually near the clubhouse. The fear that once defined Silver Oak Estates seemed gone. "It feels different," Sarah said. Harry nodded. "It is," and he was right. The community no longer belonged to a small group of powerful individuals. It belonged to the people who lived there. Across Dallas, Andrea Langford faced ongoing legal battles and civil claims from former residents. The influence she once wielded had vanished almost overnight. The authority she believed would protect her had proven fragile when confronted by evidence and truth. Everything she built through intimidation disappeared. Everything she protected through secrecy was exposed, and everything she tried to hide ultimately became public. Late that afternoon, Harry finished planting a final row of flowers. Then he stood and looked across the neighborhood. The sunlight reflected from windows throughout Silver Oak Estates. Families walked their dogs. Neighbors talked freely. The community felt peaceful. Not because conflict had never existed, but because people had finally chosen to confront it. Harry picked up his gardening tools and headed toward the house. Behind him, the flowers moved gently in the Texas breeze. Months earlier, Andrea Langford had looked at those flowers and seen something she could control. Harry had looked at them and seen something worth protecting. In the end, that difference changed everything, because power built on arrogance can disappear in a moment. But truth, once uncovered, has a way of growing stronger with every season. And in Silver Oak Estates, justice had finally taken root.